Hi everyone. In this video, we will be talking about transformations and how they relate to shape objects. Now, as you saw from the previous video, whenever we create a shape, we have two sets of transformation values for that layer, at least as we begin. The top level transformations which belong to the layer, and then the transformations that belong to each and every one of the graphics or shapes that we create within that layer. So you can have a significant amount of transformation values all completely separate within one single layer. So let's illustrate this. So I want to create from my shapes tool, I want to go ahead and create a shape layer on this side. I'm simply going to create a rectangle. So I'm going to constrain proportions as I am drawing this. Notice that I have nothing selected on my timeline because there's nothing there. But in order to create a shape, remember, you need to have everything deselected. So now that when I start clicking and dragging, I create my shape layer. Now, one thing to observe at this point before we continue is that I created my shape layer here, but my shape, that layer, I created my shape, but that layer, its anchor point is in the center of the screen. So if I were to call the rotation values for that layer right now, and I were to rotate, you will notice that my shape rotates based on that particular point where the anchor point is, which might not be what you want when you're creating shape layers. So how do I bring that anchor point to the center of my object? How do I bring that anchor point to the center of the shape? Well, the way to do that is by selecting the layer, and then if you press Control on your keyboard and long press it, keep it pressed, double click the pan behind tool. When you do that, the anchor point moves to the center of the layer that you have of the shape that you have selected, and that becomes the center of the layer at that point. So if I go ahead and now call the rotation value for that layer and I rotate, that is perhaps what you were looking for. So you don't have to create all the shapes in the center of the screen. That's, I guess, what I'm trying to say. You can create them whatever you want and then bring the anchor point to the center of that shape by double clicking while pressing Control on the keyboard, double click the pan behind tool, and that should take care of that. That should bring it back to its own position. Now, with that said, let's go ahead and take a look at let's uncollapse that shape layer 1, and you'll notice that it has its own set of values. It has the properties that we have worked with, the transformation properties that we have been working with throughout the class. But if I uncollapse the contents for the layer, remember from the previous video, we can have more than one shape within a layer. In this case, this is the rectangle 1 shape that we have inside that layer. If I uncollapse that, it has its own set of transformations down here. So these values, these are my transform values for that particular layer. And they, work just like the transformation values. Let's take a look at scaling, for example, or the actual rotation value for it. I can keyframe these, as you can see. So all of it applies just like my transformations for the layer. The difference being is that these affect only that particular shape. They do not affect the overall layer. While these ones at the upper level, these ones down here, they actually do affect the entirety of the layer. So whatever content I have within that layer will obey that particular those particular transformations. So for example, if let's say I'm going to collapse the contents right now, I'm just going to keep the transformation open for the layer, and I want to go ahead and change its position. So I'm going to set a keyframe for position here at the beginning, and then I'm going to go down to about 2 seconds on my timeline, and then I'm going to move that box across the screen. So when I do that, my box is moving across the screen, and that is nice. That's exactly what I expected to do. Now, if I go into the contents now for the rectangle, uncollapse the rectangle all the way to its transformations inside the actual shape, and then go ahead and apply a rotation set of keyframes for it. For example, I can rotate this once from here to here. You will notice that those two things work in tandem. However, let's say, for example, I find myself mischievous and I want to trick the computer. I want to go ahead and set a keyframe value for for position at this point. And then I want to have the same position for it at this point. Well, if I go ahead and move that shape layer, if I move this on the x-axis backward, you will notice that my shape tends to stay on that end. So I can actually counteract whatever the parent layer is trying to tell it to transform. Now, I don't see a use for this except when you're trying to trick the computer to do, or the composition to do something like you want something rotating around something else and you want whatever it was the center of gravity not to rotate. That is something that you might want to do, and that would be an instance in which you would use something like this. But know that they are independent. The whole point to this is that the transformations are independent from each other. Now, these transformations, like I said, inside the shapes belong to the shape itself. What that means is the following. Let me go ahead and create a circle shape inside that shape layer. So I'm going to select the shape layer, and I'm going to click and drag, and you'll notice that now I have a rectangle shape and an ellipse shape as well. If I uncollapse the ellipse shape, it also has transformation values of its own. So I can go ahead and uncollapse that and change its values and keyframe them. However, these two shapes obey the master transformation settings from the very top, the ones that belong to the actual layer. So these control everything that happens. Therefore, these ones up here are for position, and that will move both shapes across the screen. Okay. However, if I uncollapse this, the ellipse is independent from the rectangle. So I can change opacity settings for the ellipse. Let's say I'm going to make use of my knowledge of Wiggler, which we learned a couple of modules ago, and apply a wiggling motion set of keyframes. So let's go ahead and let's work with opacity, for example. So if I apply a keyframe here with opacity of 100%, let's make it 99. And then I go to my 2-second mark, and I create a new keyframe by changing that value to 100. You'll notice that as soon as I hit return or enter, I get the second keyframe. I can now select both of those and go to my Wiggler utility. I can also, if you don't have it open, you can go to the Window, Wiggler drop-down menu, click on it, and it will open up this window for you. Now, in this case, what I want to do is I want to select those two, and I want to change the type of graph that I want for this, which is temporal, because this is a change that happens over time. I want to change it from smooth to jagged, and I want to make this changes about 10 per second and a magnitude of 100. So that's basically saying change about 10 times every second, which is actually a lot if you ask me. And so we might not actually see a lot of change on this, is what I'm trying to say. And the magnitude is about 100% of the opacity. So we're going to be working with that value. So let's go ahead and click apply. This will generate random numbers for the value of opacity of that circle as it goes through time. So let me go ahead and click off elsewhere. Let me deselect to not create a new shape and press the 0 key on my keyboard or the space bar to create that preview. And you'll notice that my circle it's got that little blinking on it. It might not be noticeable in your computers because I'm capturing this at 15 FPS, but it is there. So it gives you that kind of like a little blink. If I want to make it more evident, you guys saw how I did this with position, so I can go ahead and create position keyframe values as well. And whoops, let me go ahead and make that -20 just a bit. And I'm going to change those two keyframes, selecting those two keyframes. I'm going to apply a wiggler. In this case, I want to change the settings for position. So let me select both of them. I want to have a spatial path in this case because I'm moving through space. Jagged is what I want. All independent. I want this to be 10 and then a change of about 100. So I'll apply that. And you will see a more significant amount of change for the position changes of the circle. But you'll notice that it's independent. That ellipse is independent from the rectangle, which is independent. It's not independent. It actually obeys the transformation values of the overall layer. So the parent layer, the top layer, top level, controls all of the transformations for anything that's inside it, but all of the other ones retain independent transformation values, which is extremely helpful when it comes to working with shapes, because you are not only saving real estate, but you have more control over each one of the objects independently.